Now, 106 is a recoilless rifle they used in Vietnam. And all I heard was somebody holler, "Clear the back blast area, clear the back blast area." And I'm sitting there and I looked around, I didn't see anything. Next thing I knew, this thing went off and I found myself flying down the mountain and I landed in the triple strand concertina wire with my pants around my ankles and screaming. Well, the Marines heard me holler. The four-holer had collapsed inside itself, and the back blast from that 106 blew me down the hill. It didn't hurt me, but it sure did surprise the heck out of me. They thought that was real funny. Well, I think it was a few days later. We had set up on the other side of the hill, and I was in a kind of a bunker, and next to the Tipsy 21. And it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. It started raining. It was raining so hard up there that you couldn't hear anything and you couldn't see anything. So we shut the radar machine down because it just didn't work in the rain like that. And then at 2 o'clock in the morning, we heard the most horrendous sound of whistles going off and then explosions going off all around. Grabbed my rifle and we were getting hit. We were hit that night on Catfish 2. Now there was a foxhole close to where I was, and there were 3 Marines in the foxhole, I remember. A grenade was thrown inside their foxhole. 1 Marine was killed, 2 were thrown out. And there were grenades all over the top of that hill. Some went off and some didn't. And when I looked out, like I said, it was raining real hard. I couldn't tell the Marines from the VC. I didn't know which was which, so I didn't shoot either one. I knew they were running around on top of the hill, but they couldn't see either. And it was just really strange. They were screaming and hollering and stuff going off. I remember the mortar platoon started dropping mortars, and 106s started shooting flechette rounds that killed a few VC. A flechette round is like an artillery shell, but it has these little darts. It's not a, and it's shot like a shotgun. So all these darts fly through the air and tear up whatever they hit. Marines on the other side of the hill were hit. And like I said, there were hand grenades all over the place. After a while, they started running back down the hill. One of them ran into me and stabbed me in my right hand. He didn't make it. We had counted 24, I think, VC on top of the hill. They estimated that over 200 of them had hit us that night. The colonel came down the next day to inspect the area, and all he said, he got off his helicopter, and all he said was, "Good job." Got back on his chopper and flew away. And so we took the bodies of the deceased Vietnamese, and believe it or not, put them in that 4-holer hole that I had dug. They didn't look real to me. They looked like mannequins. And they had this stench about them that kind of went in the back of my throat, like a metallic taste that they gave off. Hard to describe. And it was surreal. Like I said, the bodies didn't look like people. They looked like mannequins. We put them in the hole, as many as we could find. And Then that morning, I'll never forget, I went on the other side of this hill and I looked down where the mortar platoon had been. Just below them on another little hill, everybody was watching this strange sight. It was a huge rock ape that was sunning himself. He was a big red monkey. And he had stretched out on the side of this mountain and was just kind of enjoying the sunrise, just sunbathing. Well, I wrapped my hand with my t-shirt. I didn't think I was hurt that bad. Then I went with the Marines that had come out to the hill. I think they were from Echo Company or Fox Company, I can't remember. And we went down through the jungle in the area that we thought the VC had come from. We went on patrol and went down into a area where there was a little grass huts, and not a village, but necessarily, but there were these big piles of hay. They had carried some of their bodies of the VC and they stuck them in this big pile of hay. I guess they were trying to hide them from us. That was the other thing that was kind of strange. The VC actually had comm wire wrapped around their ankles when they hit us. And that was if we had killed them or, blew them apart or something, that their friends would pull the comm wire and pull their bodies down so we couldn't get an accurate count. That they wanted accurate body counts, actual body counts, If you're out on patrol and you got 10 men and you get in an ambush and say you kill 5 or 6 VC, in order to get an accurate body count, they didn't come out to you and count the bodies laying on the ground. They wanted you to bring them back and then line them up. Then some guy from regiment or something would come down and he'd count them. Well, this was a kind of a ridiculous practice, because if you were walking in 2 days or 4 days or whatever, you're in the bush and you got to carry these guys out and there's only 10 of you and there's 5 or 6 bodies. Well, the colonel figured it out. He said, bring back the right ear. Well, it was a heck of a lot lighter and made a lot more sense. The left ear didn't count, just the right ear. Well, we did that for a while. Now, I never cut an ear off, but I would have had the opportunity presented itself. But I do know of a lot of Marines that brought back ears. And what we would do is turn them into sick bay when they got back, and the corpsman, then someone from sick bay would count the ears and then dispose of them. Well, that's what they were supposed to do. It just so happened that there was a young corpsman who decided he wanted to be show his family something really unique from Vietnam. So like a dummy, he took one of the ears and sent them home. And the next thing you knew, the policy of cutting the right ear off stopped. There was a big investigation, and we didn't do that anymore. My hand had swollen up so bad, it had made like 2 hands. So I went to sick bay when I got back. Just walked up to sick bay. And Corpsman looked at me, and the doc took a look at my hand, and he said, we got to send you to B-Med. B-Med was a kind of like an advanced hospital area down on the beach at Chu Lai. So they sent me down to B-Med. And when I got down there, the corpsman or the doctor put me out and operated on my hand and shoved penicillin into the area because my hand was really infected and it was in bad shape. It was in such bad shape that the doctor there decided to send me to Nha Trang, which they did. Now, I was out of it. I mean, they had drugged me good when I was at Med. So I don't remember a whole lot about the flight down to Nha Trang, but I do remember Nha Trang. Nha Trang was an Army hospital. And Nha Trang, I learned later on, was known as the Riviera of South Vietnam. And I think it was. It was a beautiful place. The doctors, as soon as I got down there, reoperated on my hand, cut my hand even more, and put more penicillin in my hand and left the wound open so it would drain real good. While they put me in the ward, I met Clayton Ramon. Now, Clayton Ramon was in Special Forces, and he was Hawaiian. And I remember he was a sergeant in Special Forces, and he'd been shot in the leg, and his rack was right close to mine. So when I first met Clayton Ramon, we were in Hawaii together, and we were in one of those POW camps I told you about earlier, escape and evasion school. And so we hit it off together again in this hospital, and both of us were ambulatory. We could get up and walk around finally. And they let us go on liberty for a few hours, left the hospital to go to Nha Trang. Well, Clayton Ramon knew about the area a whole lot more than me, so I just kind of followed him, went down to the beach, and along the beach in Nha Trang, there were these little grass huts, and every one of them was a bar. And you have to understand, I hadn't had cold beer in a long time. So, we went to these little grass huts along the beach, and it was a relatively nice experience. And then we went back to the hospital. And when I walked into the hospital, I heard the doctors talking about me. They said that they were going to send me back to the States. Yeah, I was supposed to be medevaced out of Vietnam. So I decided that wasn't a good idea. I wasn't hurt all that bad. So I went to supply there at the hospital, got my helmet and my cartridge belt and my rifle and whatever else I came in with, my uniform, and went out on right next to the hospital was the Hilo landing pad. They had a lot of helicopters there, and I just walked around up there and I asked if anybody was heading to Chu Lai. And one of the guys said, well, I'm going to Da Nang right now, and you can catch a ride from Da Nang to Chu Lai. So I thought that was a good idea. So I hopped on the helicopter. We flew to Da Nang. When we landed at Da Nang, I hopped off that chopper and found another guy that was flying to Chu Lai. I hopped on that chopper. I think that was a Huey. It was one of my first times on a Huey. And so we flew back to Chu Lai. Now my hand's still wrapped up, it's still draining actually. And got to Chu Lai, and I caught a ride in a Jeep with a corpsman who was going back to 2-4. When we got back to 2-4, we drove in, and I hop out of the Jeep right at the command post. And out from the tent comes a sergeant major, and he said, Darrow, where have you been? The colonel wants your ass now. So I had to report to the colonel. Come to find out that nobody knew where I had been for the last, I don't know how many weeks. And my parents had actually received a telegram that I was missing in action. So, of course, my dad, being ex-military and everything, contacted his congressman, who contacted regiment, who contacted the colonel, who had no answers at that time, and because nobody knew where I was. And so the colonel said to me, why haven't you written your parents? And of course, I showed him my hand. I said, I can't write. And he said, well, you're going to write, and you're going to write at least once a week. Now, he also, at the same time, had information that I had gone AWOL from the hospital and that they were looking for me to lock me up, I guess. So I explained to the colonel I wanted to come back. I told him everything that had happened. And he said, all right. He said, you're going to stay here. We're going to take care of you. We'll give you something to do while your hand's getting better. And don't worry about it. So the colonel actually fixed my indiscretion because I wasn't running away. I was trying to get back. Shortly thereafter, I found myself on top of a mountain with a BC scope. That's a kind of a binocular. And my job was to look out over this rice paddy area toward Anton. And there was a little village there that was just on the edge of the rice paddies called No Name Village, which was not supposed to be occupied. And I was to report if anything moved outside of No Name Village. Well, a couple days earlier, well, let me back up. During that time, you remember I told you about the Nason lighters that the Marines had in Okinawa? Well, they were being put to good use because the people that had come down the road that I saw when we first got there were actually being evacuated from their little grass huts in the jungle and their little villages. And the Vietnamese ARVN troops were evacuating all the people out of there because the VC were using those areas to steal rice, to store ammo, etc. So what we were supposed to do is burn down those villages, burn down the huts to keep the VC from being able to use them, and the NVA, who were in our area also. That's North Vietnamese Army. And somebody, I think, took a picture of a Marine burning down a hut, and we became known as Zippo Marines. That was the first time that I'd heard that expression. Well, a couple days before I went up on top of this mountain to watch No Name Village, I saw a helicopter land right in the center of our compound, our command post area. Out from this helicopter, and by the way, it was an unusual looking helicopter. It had a big glass bubble on it. I call it a bubble helicopter. Out from this helicopter came General Westmoreland. General Westmoreland walked up to Colonel Fisher and he said, and I quote, "You will not burn down another damn village." Turned around, got back in his helicopter and left. Well, a couple days later, I'm up there looking out over this rice paddy with a BC scope, and I saw something moving in at No Name Village. So I called the CP and I told him what I saw. And next thing you know, I got the colonel up there and he said, "What you got, Big Bear?" So he looks out over the area, looks through the BC scope. He said, "Let's call in some illumination so we can see a little better. Call it in low." So it dawned on me what he was talking about. And I called in low illumination over No Name Village, gave him the coordinates and the height that these flares would go off. And that night, we burnt down No Name Village. Well, the Viet Cong and the NVA were perplexed. They didn't know how to fight the Marines. As a matter of fact, after that first encounter on Catfish 2, there was a VC captured somewhere around the DMZ. And he had a note on him that referenced Chu Lai and the Marines around there. And the note basically was asking for instructions of how do we fight these Marines. It said they never run and they never smile. Well, I don't know about never smiling. I used to smile all the time. But that just shows you the frustration that the Viet Cong was experiencing after meeting with us. Now, I had a lot of really good Marines in my squad. There was Lance Corporal Esmahan, who had joined with the Scouts in Hawaii. He was an Arab, spoke fluent Arabic, and he became a good friend of mine. Tell you a little story about him. When we were in Hawaii, like I said, we used to play jokes on each other, especially the new guys. Well, Esmahan reported in, so we decided we were going to play a big joke on him. There he was standing there in his dress greens, and he was a Lance Corporal, and he'd made the Scouts. That was a real good achievement as it was. So he was new, and we asked him if he had signed all his paperwork. And he thought about it, and he said, what paperwork? And we said, well, did you sign your masturbation papers? Well, of course he said no. So I was chosen to take him to the office so that he could sign his paperwork. Well, when we got in there, it was a big joke, and everybody kind of snickered and laughed when he said he was in there to sign his masturbation papers. But the CO didn't think that was funny, and he had heard us laughing out in the front of the office. So he came out, we all stood at attention. He said, well, I'll tell you what. He said, let's go over and see if the colonel has a copy of those papers for you. Well, my heart dropped to the bottom of the floor, and he proceeded, the CO proceeded to march us over to the command post where Colonel Fisher was. We were marched in front of Colonel Fisher, who said, what are you doing here? And then, we explained that Esmahan had not signed his masturbation papers. So Colonel Fisher, in his infinite wisdom, decided to send us over to talk to General Kulak. Oh boy. I figured, well, there goes my entire Marine Corps career. So we were sent over to General Kulak's office. We walk into General Kulak's office, and when he found out what we were there for, he about had a fit. And instead of busting me like he probably should have, he just kicked us out of his office and sent us back. And all the way back over to the barracks, Esmahan was saying, but I haven't signed my masturbation papers. I told him, shut up. So we finally made it back, and that was a big joke. But Esmahan became a good friend of mine. And then there was Regner. Regner was German. He was from Germany, and he spoke fluent German and French and a number of other languages. There was Byron Kinney. Byron Kinney was a corporal from, he lived in Texas for a while, and he lived in California for a while, and he was one tough Marine. And there was Mayfield. He was good with a radio. And then, of course, P.T. Scott that I told you about, and Don Johnson, my best friend, and some other Marines. I can't remember their names offhand. But I did want to tell you another thing about Esmahan. One time, well, it was the time I told you about when I first had command of the patrol that went out where we captured all the police force and the fire department and all them. That was my first time as a squad leader. And as we were leaving the CP area, S-Man was stationed at a bunker that we passed at the entrance of the road that went into the CP. And as we walked down the road, he started playing the Marine Corps hymn on his harmonica. Something came over me, and I thought, I really believed, that that was the very last song I would ever hear in my life. But it wasn't, praise the Lord, and I just kept on going, and you know the rest of that story. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about another thing that happened. We had some pets that we'd gathered here and there. One of them was a little dog that we called Sea Ration. And Sea Ration was a cute little thing and would follow us everywhere. He particularly liked me. I don't know why, but he did. And he would follow me around. And this happened at the time that I had mess duty. There were a number of other pets in the battalion. As a matter of fact, 155s that was stationed close to our tent had a pet python. And later on, they had a pet monkey. But word came down from headquarters to the battalion that all the pets had to be eliminated. We had to get rid of them one way or another. Now, the Vietnamese had a habit of eating dogs. So taking Sea Ration to, giving them to the Vietnamese was out of the question. And because of the fact that I was on mess duty and all the other scouts were on patrol or on duty somewhere, it fell on me to get rid of Sea Ration. This was the hardest thing I had to do in Vietnam. I did not want to hurt that dog, but I had orders. So I gathered up my courage. I took Sea Ration on top of a little mound of sand. I dug a hole. I put him inside that hole, and I had a lead pipe that, believe it or not, I put a towel around. I don't know why I did that. And this little dog faced away from me and cringed. It knew what was going to happen. It took me a little while, but I had to gather up a lot of courage. I hit that dog on the head and buried him quickly. And when I turned around and walked down the hill, there was Sergeant Klein. Sergeant Klein was in charge of the scouts at that time. And all he said to me was, "Darrow, you're a hell of a Marine." Oh, that meant a lot to me, and still I was very sad about what I just had to do. Now, the pet python, I'll tell you a story about that. When 155 by our tent, they used to take their pet and put it in our tent. So we had this python that would eat a lot of Sea Rations and whatever else we could feed it. It ate rats, which I was happy about. And so one day we took this python and we rolled it up and put it on P.T. Scott's rack and put a blanket over it. Well, Scott came out off patrol and he took off his backpack and everything, and laid down on this rack, and he felt, it wasn't right. Got up, moved the blanket, screamed, and left the tent. He would not come back in there until we got rid of that snake. That was funny. Later on, we were in a kind of a bunker, and there were 4 of us in this bunker. And believe it or not, that was a rest period, because that meant 25% watch. One person had to stay awake all night. But since there were 4 of us, we got more sleep. Well, it was dusk, and we wanted some water, so I told Scott to go back and fill the canteens. He went back into this tent, and I heard this horrible scream, and here comes Scott. The canteens went flying everywhere, and he dove headfirst into our bunker, into the foxhole line. He said, "I'm not going back in there. There's a monster. It attacked me." I said, "What?" So I got up out of the hole and walked over and picked up the canteens and walked in the tent. And I'm looking around, and it was dark in there. I didn't see anything. And then all of a sudden, this thing jumped on my shoulder and grabbed my face. Well, at first, it really startled me. I was just as scared as Scott was. Then I realized what it was. It was a pet monkey. Well, what had happened was this monkey was tied up to a pole, and it had got himself wrapped around the pole. So I unwrapped the monkey, kept it on my shoulder, got the water in the canteens, and walked back into the foxhole with Scott and the other guys. Scott went to the other side of the bunker as far as he could get. He said, "Take that thing out of here." Well, I kept the monkey in the bunker, and Scott stayed awake all night. That was kind of funny. And speaking of things that were funny, one time we were playing cards. We used to play cards, like on the rack to just pass the time, not for real money. We didn't have any real money. The money that we did have, though, was, we used to call it funny money. And it looked really weird. It did not look like American money. It had a picture of a girl on it and a girl's face. I'll show you pictures of it here. Anyway, we were playing with Monopoly money. And, just not betting for real, but just betting big bucks, $100 here, $100 there. And then this kid came up with a bicycle, and he had beer in the bicycle. Well, we didn't have any money. So I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I threw a $20 Monopoly money bill at Don Johnson. I said, "Here, go buy us some beer." Well, John picked up the money. I was kidding. I was really kidding. But John picked up the money, he looked at it, and he went outside, and pretty soon all these kids came up with all this beer. And it dawned on us that they didn't know the difference between Monopoly money and our funny money. They thought it was real. Well, that started something. The word got out, and pretty soon everybody was buying stuff with Monopoly money. As a matter of fact, my wife's first husband, who was a major in Vietnam, flew Hueys, sent home for Monopoly money. Anyway, how we got caught was a Viet Cong was killed in an ambush, and he had stacks of Monopoly money to take to North Vietnam and exchange it for American money. We almost busted the entire Vietnamese economy with that little trick. But the regiment, of course, came down and said, "Don't do that anymore." So we stopped doing that. But everybody was doing it. Now, I've told you about eating sea rations and how we used to, make up different recipes and all that, that's when we had C rations. But sometimes we'd go on patrol and we'd only carry enough C rations for maybe 1 or 2 days. And it might be a 4-day patrol. That's 4 days in and 4 days out. So a lot of times we'd run out of C rations. One time, I can remember getting so hungry that I actually ate the instant coffee, paper and all, that came in these little C ration packs. And then there was another time that we actually had found some North Vietnamese chow, and it was kind of like the first MREs. You see, they'd had their C rations wrapped up in a kind of a plastic bag, and all you had to do was add hot water, and mostly it was rice and fish. But I can remember eating those MREs, and they were just as good as ours almost. Shortly after we first got to Vietnam and had set up the command post on the other side of the tracks, I was told to go with the corpsman to the Chu Lai New Life Hamlet, which was the village that was set up by the Seabees. When we got there, it was just he and I. A Vietnamese man led us to the outside of the village where there was a little girl that was laying alongside the rice paddy. She had been shot through the hip. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. I picked her up and carried her into the village, and we found a hut that we went into, and I laid her down on a cot, and of course the corpsman went to work right away. I asked the corpsman how she was, if she was going to make it. The corpsman looked up at me and said, well, she's going to make it, but she'll never have babies. Now that kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. Then the Vietnamese man that we first met took me to where we had first picked the girl up. And across the rice paddies, just on the other side, I was looking for where the shot may have come from. And I knew it didn't come from us. But in the grass on the other side of these rice paddies was something, all I can describe it as is like a crop circle. There was these characters that were pushed down in the rice on the side of this little knoll that looked like what you'd call crop circles, but they were in the shape of Chinese characters. Now, nobody could tell me what those characters meant, what they said, but I'll never forget that. I went back to the place where I had taken the little girl, and the corpsman had already contacted somebody to come and get her and take her to the hospital. There was another time that I was on a mountain, and I couldn't tell you today where it was, but it was a rocky hill, and it was, I guess around noon or so, and there was another friend of mine that was a sniper. He was a Marine sniper, but he didn't use a sniper rifle. What he was armed with was a 50 caliber, looked like a machine gun with a scope mounted on it. And he was positioned in this rocky crevice. You had to kind of get yourself into a weird position to sit behind this machine gun that was pointed in the direction of a village that had to be over 1,000 yards away. Anyway, I walked over and I was talking to him, and he had looked through his scope every now and then, and they had hot coffee. It was the first time that we'd had hot coffee on top of this hill. So I asked him if he'd like to go get some hot coffee and I'd take his place. And he said, sure. So he got up out of his position. I got down into it, and I looked through the scope, and the sniper gave me a couple of instructions about how to shoot that machine gun if I had to. And so he went up and got some coffee. Well, I started looking through the scope, and I noticed something moving in this village. Now, there shouldn't have been anything in this village. It was one of those places that we had cleared out a long time before. But I saw this thing moving and couldn't hardly tell what it was. And then the more I looked at it, the more I realized that what I was looking at was a man. It looked like he was carrying a radio that had a whip antenna. Now, this was a Vietnamese. I thought he was a Viet Cong. And so I motioned to the lieutenant to take a look, and he came over and looked through his binoculars. And he said, take the shot. Well, I turned around, and my buddy was standing there with his coffee, and he said, go ahead, Bill, take the shot. So I looked through the scope and aimed in carefully, and I fired this 50 caliber rifle. Well, whatever it was out there stopped moving. I couldn't see him anymore. So the lieutenant got some Marines together. They took a patrol and went down and went across the rice paddies and went into this village. And they called back, and they said that they found the body of an old man that was carrying a pile of sticks. And one particular stick he had was kind of stuck in it, and it looked like he had been carrying a radio with a whip antenna. They estimated that the shot was over 1,000 yards. I'd hit him in the head. That was a heck of a shot, but he never felt it. And to this day, I pray that he was a Viet Cong. At any rate, he should not have been where he was. You know, I think that some people were just born funny. Case in point is P.T. Scott. Now, P.T. Scott kept us in stitches most of the time. He would just do things that were hilarious. And his expressions and his reactions were really funny. Now, one time we were on a patrol by the airstrip, and it was at night. And at night, when you're walking through sand dunes, everything in the front of you looks level. But when you're walking in them, it goes up and down, and, you know, it's not easy to walk through sand dunes at night. And I saw this big bush ahead of us, and Scott was the point that night on patrol. And I watched him go up on top of the sand dune by this bush, and then all of a sudden it was like he just disappeared. I didn't see him, and I didn't hear him. And I thought, oh, brother, what happened now? So I got to the top of this sand dune, and of course, when you're on patrol in Vietnam, you don't want to make a lot of noise, you know. And I heard this voice. It was saying, help, help. Well, I got, crawled a little closer to the edge of this big bush, and I realized that on the other side of this bush was like a huge 10-foot hole, and at the bottom of the hole was P.T. Scott. He said, get me out of here. So it took us a while to get him out of that hole. I had to put my rifle down and have him grab onto it so we could pull him out. And there was another time we were coming back off of patrol, and this time Scott was the rear point. He was the last guy on the patrol. And we were coming down a dry, rocky riverbed. Had a lot of rocks in it, and there were a lot of boulders and stuff on both sides. And I knew where we were on the map. So I thought, oh, look, I think we can get around this huge boulder that was on my right and climb up above that and get on a road that engineers had just built like the day before. So I worked my way around this boulder, and I took the rest of the patrol, and we all climbed around this boulder and got on top of the hill. And I started counting heads, and there was one missing. So I took Don Johnson. I said, oh, where's Scott? And we went back down around the side of this boulder. And when we got to the bottom, there were bushes on both sides that we had gone through. And we heard this. Oh. Oh. Hey, you guys. Hey. And John and I stood there and watched for a while, and there was Scott, and he would back up and run as hard as he could and grab onto the boulder and try to climb it. He thought we had gone up that way. Well, of course, we hadn't. So after watching him for a couple of minutes, I said, Scott. And he about fell out. And then I took him around to the boulder and took him to the top. And, he would do just hilarious things like that. One time, I positioned myself on the side of a hill. Now, there were bushes all around me and behind me, but in front of me, I had a clear field of view. I could see everything all the way into the jungle. It was a good spot. And so I broke out some sea rations, and I was sitting there eating my dinner. It was dusk. And I heard somebody talking behind me. And what they said was this: "Did you hear that?" And I realized it was a lieutenant. He had just gotten there. It was a young lieutenant. He said, "Listen, listen." Well, I was listening. I thought he had heard something. Actually, I think it was me. So this lieutenant threw a baseball grenade. Now, the baseball grenade hit the bush behind me and went off. And I hollered, "Hey!" after a few other things. And I think when a baseball grenade goes off, this was relatively new grenade to Vietnam, it has these little serrated pieces of wire on the inside. And I'm sure I caught a couple of pieces of that wire, because later on in life, I had these pieces of wire started working out. And I went to the doctor, and they operated on my back, and sure enough, they took out a little piece of shrapnel. And that's the only time I can remember that I was possibly hit by a frag grenade or parts of it. It didn't really hurt me all that badly at the time. Matter of fact, I didn't even realize I was hit. Busted my eardrums, though. And I was bleeding from the ears, and that caused a great deal of discomfort. But I didn't go to sick bay. I just, kind of shrugged it off. And I didn't even know if my back had been bleeding at all. I was actually hurt a lot worse than I thought because when I was in my 40s, I went to the hospital and had a piece of shrapnel removed from my kidney. Saddle up. That meant get all your gear and let's go. Heard that thousands of times. I remember another time on patrol with Sergeant Klein, and it had been raining. We were coming back to our area. We were somewhere, I don't know, a click away or something like that. And all of a sudden, it started raining real hard. So we put our ponchos on, and we kept going back toward our area. And then something went off. It was a mortar round. It was one of our mortar rounds, and it was close, but it was on the other side of this little hill. So we got down and waited. Pretty soon another mortar round dropped, and this time it dropped on the other side of us. One was on the other side of this little hill, the other was on the other side of this rice paddy. And I thought that rather strange, because what I initially thought was that 81 mortars had ordered to, hit some VC that could have been on the other side of this hill. Anyway, pretty soon, 2 more mortar shells dropped, and they were closer. And all of a sudden, I realized what was happening. They were bracketing us. That is, putting one a little bit closer to where they thought the enemy was. The only problem was they thought we were the enemy. I remember getting up to Sergeant Klein and saying, hey, you got to tell them to cease fire. Pretty soon another couple mortars dropped, and that was real close. And I'm going to tell you something. You don't want to be close to an 81 mortar when it goes off. Fortunately, this was on top of a hill, and we were like on the military crest. Not at the top, not at the bottom, but kind of in between. And the blast went over our heads. So we grabbed the radio and hollered for them to cease fire, and they did. We dodged the bullet on that one. Well, like I told you before, Vietnam was really hot. And I remember one time I was on top of this hill. We had no shade at all. And the water in our canteens was hot, flavored with halazone. And we'd been up there for some time, and a chopper landed to kind of resupply us up there. And, they were throwing off cases of sea rats and stuff like that. And I'll never forget this guy, never. He was a gunner. And like I said, we didn't have anything cold. And it was right miserable. Well, this guy, just before the chopper took off, threw me a cold orange. Now that was really something. It was a cold, ice cold orange. He must have got it from, I don't know, the cooler back there where he got in his chopper or something. Anyway, I had that orange, and it was like a piece of gold in my hand, and I shared it with 3 other scouts that were on top of the hill with me. So the 4 of us feasted on that very cold orange. Now, another thing about those choppers, sometimes when they would take off from the top of a mountain, they wouldn't go straight up. They would kind of go up and then go down and then go up again. And there was another time that a resupply chopper had landed up there on the hill, and I was kind of down on the military crest, which is not the top of the hill, it's not the bottom, it's kind of in between. And I looked up, and the chopper was above me, and it took off and dipped, and the wheel of that chopper hit me right on top of the head. Fortunately, I was wearing my helmet, and right on top of the helmet that I was wearing was a great big, looked like a skid mark. And I looked up and I saw the wheel of this chopper kind of turn a little bit, and it had just bounced off my head. That was quite of an experience. Now, these experiences that I'm relating are in no way in a chronological order. It's just kind of how I remember things. One thing will lead to another. Anyway, I'll tell you about another thing that happened. One time, I was manning a bunker with another Marine, and the day before, we had set up a 55-gallon drum on the side of a hill that was overlooking this valley that had a lot of concertina wire in it. We had been penetrated for a week or two before this Marine and I took over this bunker. And so we took this 55-gallon drum and we made what's called flue gas. Now, flue gas is a kind of a combination of anything that will burn, like kerosene or jet fuel or, fuel for tanks or whatever we could find. And we filled this thing up. We also put soap flakes in it. Now, the soap flakes would burn and stick, kind of like a napalm. Anyway, we had set this stuff up, and I put a claymore on this 55-gallon drum and ran wire from the claymore back to my bunker. And that night, while we fixed up our bunker, I had my hand grenades all lined up nice and neat, sitting on the sandbags. I had 2 sticks in the sandbags that gave me a field of fire, put one on the right, one on the left, rifle in the center, and I didn't want to shoot beyond this radius I had made. It was rather neat. And we had our bunker really camouflaged well. It was about 1:30 in the morning, something like that. And we heard something on the wire. Now, what we did also on this concertina wire was take empty sea ration cans and put rocks in them so that if anything disturbed them, they'd make a sound. We heard this sound coming from the concertina wire. So I told my buddy that was in the hole with me, I said, look, you hit that flare, and we had pop-up flares. You hit that flare and I'll hit the flue gas. And he said, okay. So he shot the flare up and I hit the flue gas, and that stuff spread all over the bottom of that valley. It was quite a sight. But then something else happened. This flame came over our heads, actually burnt the sea bags where I'd put all my grenades and everything, and it was rather hot. So we grabbed our helmets and rifles and ran out of that bunker to the top of this little hill. And I took my head and ran it right into the bottom of a flame tank that had moved up behind us that we didn't know was there. And this flame tank, when I set off the flue gas, opened fire. Now I had these flames going on top of us, And that was very interesting. The next day we had a couple of crispy critters on the wire. They had tried to penetrate us. What the VC would do, a lot of times, we learned this the hard way, actually. The Marines would set out claymores in front of their position. Now, a claymore is set so that it looks like a half-moon mine, and the round portion has this side toward the enemy stamped on it, and that's the side you want to put away from you. Thousands of little ball bearings will fly through the air. Well, the VC got smart, and they would come up and take the claymores and turn them around facing our positions, and then they would go down and rattle the wire. The Marines would set off the claymores, and claymores were facing them. It was August 18th, 1965. We got the word to saddle up, and we mounted helicopters, that is, hotel company did, and we flew south from Chulai. When we got to our destination, we saw poles. They were long poles that were stuck in the ground in the rice paddy. We'd never seen them before. When the helicopters got close, they blew the poles over, and the poles blew up. These were helicopter booby traps. We came under fire right away. And when we landed, we took cover behind the rice paddy dikes, and we had landed right in the middle of a regiment of NVA. And we took casualties right away. When we shot at the huts that we received fire from, these were just grass huts, so we thought. But when the grenades hit, blew the grass off, and these were cement bunkers. Well, we found them, finally. This is what we had been waiting for. A real confrontation with the enemy. And we were up for it. We'd been waiting a long time to meet these guys, and they had no idea what they were facing. The actual battle lasted about 3 days. There was several acts of bravery that I witnessed, and one of them was Joe C. Paul. Now, Joe C. Paul was a good Marine. He was what we referred to as a good field Marine. In garrison, well, you remember I told you about the Marines that didn't like Hawaii and would go on liberty and sometimes get in trouble? Well, that was J.C. Paul. But on this day, he proved to be the best of all of us. The magnificent bastards were ready for battle, and we showed the VC and the NVA just that. There were hundreds of NVA killed in that battle. I recently saw a video on the internet that talked about Starlight. That's what this battle was called. The narrator on that video said that the Marines were inexperienced, and we relied on naval gunfire and airstrikes. But we didn't rely on naval gunfire and airstrikes, although we used them, and we were far from inexperienced. We'd been in Vietnam long enough to know the enemy, and we met him head on. All the enemy could do was run. That's the ones that survived. We also captured quite a few. It was, I guess, a couple of weeks later that we finally did our mop-up. Yeah, we took a lot of casualties. Hotel company became known as hospital company after that. The helicopters, of course, took as many wounded as they could. And Echo Company had brought up the tanks. And we actually used tanks as medevac vehicles. And I'd like to tell you another thing about 2-4, and that is Bull Fisher. Colonel J.R. Bull Fisher walked upright on the rice paddy dike, looking out over the battle, calling in support. And Marines were down behind the rice paddy dike hollering for him to get down, but he didn't. He faced the enemy and showed immense courage and leadership. I'll never forget him. I'll always honor his memory. And the magnificent bastards proved that we were just that. No, we weren't inexperienced Marines. In the first place, the fellow that said that doesn't know two things. He doesn't know anything about the United States Marine Corps, and he doesn't know anything about the magnificent bastards. At any rate, Starlight was a memory I will never forget. Well, I knew that a lot of us were killed in action. A lot more of us were wounded in action. And the enemy lost several hundred. But I didn't know what the end result, the final figures were. That's probably because final figures didn't mean anything to me. These were my friends. These were fellow Marines. They said that there were 45 killed in action, 200 wounded. That's the ones that were physically wounded, and close to 700 VC and NVA were killed in that battle. We felt that all we had to do after Starlight was clean up Vietnam. The enemy was on the run. For us, the war was almost over. While there was talk about us being home for Thanksgiving. We had sent letters home and made plans, and we really thought that Starlight was the end of the major conflicts in Vietnam. But like I said before, things changed. I think that's when the bureaucrats and the congressmen started to micromanage the war in Vietnam. They came out with free fire zones and other stupid, idiotic ways of fighting this war. They tied our hands. The enemy was on the run. We could have cleaned up the rest of Vietnam in short order. I wrote a poem once, and the last lines go like this. The war was lost there at the end because of lice and congressmen. Brian Kinney got a newspaper article from the States that had to do with war protesters in Berkeley, California. It pissed us all off. We had thought that we were going to be sent back home, go back to the States around, Thanksgiving, Christmas. We thought basically the war was drawn to an end, that we had won after Starlight. Of course, that wasn't the case. But it wasn't the case because of congressmen. Anyway, like I said, Brian Kinney, who was in my squad at the time, received word about Berkeley, and he wrote a letter to some of his friends in Southern California. And a couple months later, he got a letter back. What I didn't know at the time was that Brian Kinney was a vice president of a group of Hells Angels in Oakland, California. And those folks in California rode up to Berkeley and made our feelings known. You see, we had planned to go to Berkeley, California, the whole battalion, armed with entrenching tools and rifle stocks. Those people at Berkeley don't know how lucky they were that they didn't send us home at that time. You see, Starlight happened in August, and by the time the letters got back and forth, the Hells Angels rode to Berkeley in October. But that's how it happened. It was Brian Kinney kind of sending a letter and requesting action be taken against those war protesters. But we had more work to do, and we did it. Well, after Starlight, the battalion had to be reinforced. We'd lost too many. And Bull Fisher thought of something else. You see, the scouts, only 12 of us at the time, were the eyes and ears of the battalion. We were the guys that would go out in front of battalion operation or, a company-sized patrol, and we were the pathfinders. We took the Marines to where we had to go. And Bull Fisher decided to beef up the scouts. So he created a new unit of Marines, and he called us Raiders. Instead of 12 scouts, we were now a unit of 30 Marines. There were 3 squads of 10 men with a platoon sergeant. Our CO was the major who was in charge of S2, which was the intelligence part of the battalion. So our chain of command was like this. There were 3 squad leaders, each one of us corporals, a sergeant, a platoon sergeant, and the major, and then the colonel. And what the Raiders were supposed to do, our mission, was to be shock troops. We were used as shock troops. We would go into a village, we'd hit them hard, and then a company would follow. We'd go in and get out fast. we were also used as battalion intelligence. And like I told you, the enemy was on the run, so this sort of tactic was not unheard of. We would go out in a 10-man patrol, break up into 5 2-man teams, go in different directions, and then come back in a different area and be picked up by a chopper. This was called hunter-killer patrols. And our mission was to gather as much combat intelligence as we could. The Raider platoon was made up mostly of Corporal E4s, and all these guys were volunteers, and they were all specialized. You know, they were like the best of the best. They were machine gunners, snipers, and scouts, and radio operators, and oh yeah, we had a corpsman too. Well, we would go on patrols. I spent more time in the jungle than I ever did back at the base camp. Another thing we did was move our base camp from the other side of the tracks to the beach area. And we got some hardback tents. We were actually living off the ground. Our living conditions at the beach were a whole lot better than how we had been living months before. Our tents were not far from Amtraks that had been stationed at the beach facing the ocean. And I remember one time, Corporal Daniels and I decided we were going to go swimming. But the reason why was because a typhoon had come in, and being former body surfers in Hawaii, that meant that surf was up and we could have a good time. We were wrong. We went swimming all right, got out there in the ocean and got in a riptide. Daniels and I were taken out to sea, so far out to sea that we couldn't see land. But the reason why we couldn't see land mostly was because of the waves. We were in some very erratic ocean, and it took a while for us to get back. By the time I got back, I couldn't walk. I looked back to where Daniels was, and he was still out there, and I could see him. I started back out toward him, and he waved me back in. And I'm glad I did go back in. I waited for him, and finally I helped him out. The very next day, 2 Marines from Amtraks went swimming in the same place that we had gone, and they didn't make it. I remember another thing that happened during that time that was kind of pleasant. There were not a lot of pleasant things that happened in Vietnam, but this was one of them. You see, I had always loved folk music. Peter, Paul, and Mary, the Brothers Four, Kinston Trio, that kind of stuff. And once I was going through this ville in Anton, and I bought a guitar. Now, I don't think I paid more than $5 American for it, but it was a nice guitar. It was hand carved and really pretty, and it had these catgut strings on it, you know, like a folk guitar. I didn't know anything about how to play a guitar at the time, but Brian Kenny came to the rescue, and he showed me 3 chords. They were Spanish chords, and that's all I knew. But sometimes when I was sitting on the beach or looking over the ocean next to Amtraks, I would start to play this song. called Greensleeves. And I would just pluck it on my guitar. So at night in Vietnam, on the beach at Chu Lai, you could hear the song being played. I wish I still had that guitar. Now, we had a opportunity to save money. Instead of getting paid, on a regular paycheck, I just let it ride from month to month. I built up a pretty good amount of money that way. And regiment, which I only visited like once or twice, had a PX. That's a post exchange. And once I went in the post exchange and I had drawn some money out and I wanted a really nice watch. So I think I paid about $300, which was a lot of money in those days for a young corporal, for a Rolex watch. I didn't have that watch more than a week. And I was on patrol once and climbing this hill, and it was raining real hard, and the hill was real muddy. And just as we got about halfway up the hill, there was a Marine in front of me, and he would, take 2 steps up and slide back, and I'd do the same thing. And all of a sudden, rounds started hitting around us. There was a sniper, a VC sniper that was shooting at us. Well, that made us move a little faster, and then I looked up, I saw that he had gotten hit in the leg. Well, it didn't seem to hurt him at all. He just kept right on going. We got all the way to the top of the hill, and I told this Marine, I said, "Hey, you're hit." And he said, "I am?" I said, "Yeah, your leg." He looked down and saw it bleeding, and he screamed, "Ah!" and fell down all the way down the bottom of the hill. And I had to go down and get him. And on my way back, carrying this Marine who just found out he'd been hit, I lost my Rolex, and I stepped on it in the mud and buried it. And it's still there. I had plans to go back and find it, but not with a guy shooting at me, so I guess Vietnam got a really nice Rolex watch. Then in October 1965, I had come back off patrol, went into the CP tent because it was raining real hard. I just got some hot chow for the first time in several weeks. And I was dripping wet. The colonel called me over, and I thought he was going to give me orders. This was Colonel Fisher. I thought he was going to give me orders for my next patrol because we had to turn right around and go right back out. So he said, "Come here, Big Bear." And I went over and saw him, and I said, "Yes, sir." And he put something in the typewriter, typed it out, signed it, folded it in half, and put it in my mouth. You see, I had my hands full of a rifle and all my gear and my hot chow, and didn't have any more room for anything, so he put it between my teeth. So I walked out of the CP tent back out in the rain. Don Johnson was standing outside, and I motioned to him. I said, "Oh." And Don Johnson took the paper out of my mouth. And I said, "Okay, what do we got to do now?" And he said, "Hey," he said, "you've just been promoted to corporal." I said, "No." He said, "Yeah," and he read it to me. It was my corporal warrant. I got promoted meritoriously to corporal in Vietnam, in the field. I've never been so proud of any other promotion that I ever received. We went on lots of patrols, like I said, and spent most of my time in the bush, in the jungle, in Vietnam, living outside, no shelter, just laying out on the ground, mostly in an ambush. Because at night, that's what we would set up.